My name is Tom Barry, and I work within the Arctic Council and the Executive Secretary for the its Biodiversity Working Group, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna. And thank you. I've been warned to be very brief because I have a tendency to talk for far too long, and I think some people here have heard me speak yesterday as well. But this is our first time participating in this forum, so I find it very interesting to meet the different industries that we encounter. Primarily, we tend to engage with oil and gas industries and to a lesser extent shipping and tourism. So it's very interesting now to start to meet people from the mining industry and elsewhere and to see how we can engage in a dialogue with them with regards to what happens in the Arctic. But when we come to speak of the Arctic, I'm not sure that everybody, people tend to have a different understanding of what the Arctic is. And anytime you try to draw a boundary or any sort of defining area in the Arctic, it's very sensitive. But the Arctic, as we describe it within the working group where I work, is this huge red area here. And that covers 32 million square kilometres. People tend to think of the Arctic as primarily marine, but this is actually more or less 57% marine and 43% terrestrial. So a huge area of the Arctic we're discussing is also terrestrial. And that little red dot is where I live in the north of Iceland. So the challenge that we're facing in the Arctic is how do we better harness our knowledge to facilitate a more informed decision making? Or to put it in other words, how do we shorten the response time between when we detect a trend or a challenge in the Arctic and we bring information and relevant policy options and tools to the states and decision makers so that they can respond accordingly? And this is a huge challenge in such a broad area. And what we do within the Arctic Council, and I explain this briefly because this is relevant for how we're now engaging on a mainstreaming dialogue, is that we conduct monitoring of status and trends of biodiversity across the Arctic. We conduct assessments or analysis on the outcomes of that monitoring. We function as the Arctic Data Service Centre, both for the Arctic Council and for other organisations such as OBIS and GBIF and so on. We develop policy options and tools for the Arctic states and organisations, and we work to communicate our findings both to the public and to the states and to involve stakeholders across the Arctic. And one thing that I haven't heard much in the talks today so far is that concerning Indigenous organisations, because the Arctic Council is a unique body in that Indigenous organisations have a seat at the table with the states and they're obliged to consult them in all their decisions and actions that they take. And so that's a unique aspect of the Arctic Council, and I think unique globally. So it means that you have perhaps a better representation of all the various stakeholders at the table when it comes to making decisions on what's happening there. What we are going to discuss today a little bit is, with the Arctic as the background, is the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment. And that's this huge brick of a book which was finalised and improved by the Arctic states in 2013. And since then we've been working to try and figure out how do we take the findings from this scientific work. There were about 250 scientists from across the globe responsible for the findings of this. And as one of the science policy groups in the Arctic Council, our challenge is how do we simplify information or repackage it so that decision makers and also other stakeholders such as industry can actually act and help implement some of the findings of it. So we went from that 600-700 page document to this. And this document is the policy document for the biodiversity assessment. And it's the primary document which is guiding how Arctic states via the Arctic Council are working with regards to address biodiversity issues in the Arctic at the moment. There were three primary themes in this assessment. There was the significance of climate change as the underlying driver of biodiversity change in the Arctic, the necessity of adopting an ecosystem-based management approach to how we tackle what's happening and understand what's happening in the Arctic, and mainstreaming of biodiversity. How do we incorporate biodiversity principles into the various industrial actions, development actions, all the different stakeholders are conducting in the Arctic. We've just had approved at a ministerial meeting this April this report, which is called Actions for Arctic Biodiversity, and it's an action plan for taking all of the 17 recommendations from the biodiversity assessment and trying to implement them. This is an action plan that's directed not just at the Arctic states and organisations, but also at non-Arctic countries and stakeholders such as industry. I like to show this map because what we're doing in the Arctic has implications for the rest of the globe. As you often hear that phrase, what's happening in the Arctic is relevant elsewhere. And this map shows the flyways for migratory birds that they spend their lifespan annually travelling up and down between different parts of the globe from north to south and back. And these red figures here indicate the rates of decline of shorebird populations along those flyways. And you can see that some of them are quite significant, for example, up to 80-90% in the southeast Australasian flyway. And you can see immediately from this map that no matter how good we are, for example, in Finland, at working to conservatively sustain our migratory bird populations, it doesn't matter that much if they're still hunting and killing them down in Southeast Asia. So in order to actually find a sustainable way to manage and reverse such declines in populations, we need to engage all stakeholders, be they non-Arctic states, industries, and Arctic organisations and countries. This is the recommendation that's relevant for our discussions today, because this is the reason that the Arctic Council, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, is engaging with this forum and our seminar that we had yesterday. And this recommendation was approved by the states, where they asked the Arctic states to require the incorporation of biodiversity objectives and provisions into all of the Arctic Council's work, but also encourage the same for development activities, for agreements, plans and operations in the Arctic. And they specifically singled out a number of industries in this: shipping, fishing, tourism and mining, but not limited to those. They're just ones that they took out as examples. So to try and figure out how we're going to take those words and turn them into a reality, or to ensure some sort of on-the-ground conservation impact, in our action plan for implementing those, we've identified 6 different steps or actions that we need to undertake. These involve strengthening and developing partnerships with industry and others, trying to find creative and innovative solutions to the challenges facing biodiversity, and in a way expanding responsibility for taking care of biodiversity to all of the various different actors in the Arctic. We need to strengthen collaboration with industry in monitoring. There's an awful lot of monitoring activities undertaken in the Arctic by industry in hard-to-reach places. We need to figure out how we can include the information and findings that they extract and incorporate that into our monitoring program, so that helps inform our policy recommendations and scientific findings. We are embarking on the development of biodiversity principles on how we might incorporate biodiversity objectives into our safeguards. I'll finish quickly. And we need to make monitoring and research results accessible through our Arctic Biodiversity Data Service. So in essence, we went through a long process of developing this assessment, putting into a form that it was easily understandable by policymakers, and now we're at the other end of that spectrum, trying to take these policy recommendations and find a way that they're easily understandable by stakeholders such as industry. So the reason that we're trying to engage with forums such as this is to try and start a dialogue or create a framework for discussion on how business might be able to help implement or develop some of these recommendations. Because we recognise that in order to make them a reality, we really do need to find a common ground. It's not enough for us to say that, you know, we try and do this, but we need to do it together. And I will finish early to allow more time for questions. Thank you.
Okay. In order to the live stream.
Sorry, I thought they were coming at the end. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it seems to be working. So we'll be taking one or two or a couple of questions after each speaker, and then save some time at the end for common discussion. Do we have any questions on the floor?
Don't put your hands up all at once, so it's okay. It's always good that the silence means that business understands everything that's happening in the Arctic and there are no questions.
Yeah, do you concur, one could ask. No questions? I was wondering if you could give us a highlight of a particular species or a particular ecosystem that you could think could be enhanced by such a cooperation that you enlighten. Give us a concrete picture, please.
Because I referred to migratory birds a while ago, and the East Australasian flyway is that flyway that's experiencing the most dramatic declines in particular shorebird species. There are some species there, such as the spoonbill sandpiper, which 30 odd years ago there was maybe 6,000 breeding pairs. Today there's perhaps a little over 100. And they've been declining at an annual rate of about 25-26%. And unless we find a way to actively implement some effective conservation measures which try and stop or somehow change hunting patterns, coastal reclamation along that flyway, then they reckon that that will be the first species to go extinct on that flyway in early 2020s. So that's a good example, perhaps a dramatic one, but one that shows you that if we're to try and affect on the ground change, then there's an urgency to it, and it's something that we sort of need to do as a common group as opposed to individuals.
Yeah, we have a question on the ground, please. And if you can please introduce yourself at the start of your question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was excellent. My name is Matt Smith. I'm from the Joint Nature Conservation Committee in the UK. I suppose a number of facets to the question. To what extent were business, industry involved in the production of that report? Has it been well received? And going forward, what do you think are going to be the main challenges for business to reach operating in the Arctic zone?
Well, the way we tried to engage industry in the development of this report was we held a huge stakeholder consultation process, and we had the first Arctic Biodiversity Congress last year. And as part of the development of the agenda and the content of that Congress, we convened an industry advisory committee. And that had representatives from shipping and oil and gas and a number of other industries. And there we tried to engage with them on what were the issues of concern, how we would reflect that in our agenda, and what were the common areas where we would try and move forward. For example, one of the initial ideas was to develop guidelines for biodiversity in the Arctic, but a very clear message came back from all of the different industry consultations that we held that there were enough guidelines, but we needed to take a different approach. So we've been trying to engage quite a lot with industry over that process. They didn't participate as scientists in that sense in the report, but they participated in the in informing the outcomes. And I forget your second part of your question.
The second question was...
Use the microphone, please.
Sorry, yeah, the second part of my question was, are there, from the production of this report, what are the key kind of challenges that are facing industry operating within the Arctic biome?
Well, the report didn't face on the challenges that industry were facing. It's faced on the challenges that biodiversity are facing. And then based upon those, we identify specific issues or things that we need to address that could potentially be affected by the impacts of industry there. And that then falls into issues like invasive species management, how do we look at marine mammal migratory patterns and things like this.
And we've got one final question here in the first row. You have the floor.
It's more common. I'm Edward Miller from Costa Rica. Actually, this highlights the opportunity we have with the global partnership and other networks. You mentioned the birds being hunted. Actually, most importantly is the ecosystem destruction in these countries, more than actually the hunting, generally speaking. But the need to network, I mean, you have a beautiful Arctic report. It's probably missing half of it with the other ecosystem reports that are actually causing the loss of the birds. And the need to integrate different countries, different regions to be able to develop approaches, even for a specific site as the Arctic, which you think is very isolated, but it's totally interconnected. Yeah. So we do need to reach out to different platforms in different stages where we can actually join efforts with other countries to be able to have any strategy, even for a local business that's starting there.
Well, what we've done with regards to migratory birds and South America and down around to the Americas is we formed an initiative called the Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative. And we're actually in the process now, we've identified what the key threats to the priority species that are under challenge along those areas. And we're trying to reach out to those different countries and organisations along that region of the world now to come together in the sort of network that you're describing. So that's something, this has only just been finalised this April, so we're in the process of now starting to implement some of the early actions from it. But you're perfectly correct, it needs to be a cooperative effort.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks a lot for the questions.